During the Great Depression, there was a lumberjack who was desperate for work. And when he was finally offered a position, he decided he's going to work very hard. So he swung his axe and he felled many trees the first day. And the second day, he swung it just as hard, but he felled less trees. And it continued that way, where he felled less and less and less trees, even though he worked hard. And he started getting upset with himself. And finally he went to his foreman. He says, I'm swinging that axe as hard as I can. I really appreciate this job. Don't want to disappoint you. And his foreman said, when was the last time you sharpened your axe? Proverbs tells us, as iron sharpens iron, so man can sharpen each other. Today we're going to talk a little bit about how, as Grace Chapel, when we gather together, what it should look like. One of the things we should do is sharpen one another. If you look at your dishwasher, you'll see that there's a basket there that you put your utensils in. I've seen a new one recently advertised. It's actually a tray, like a little shell that comes out on the top, and you put everything neatly in its place. And one of the reasons is, while metal sharpens metal, metal dulls metal very quickly. If you just throw all that silverware in without putting in those little slots, they hit each other and they dull each other. So while metal sharpens metal, metal dulls metal. It depends how it makes contact with one another. If you sharpen each other, you're doing good to each other. But if you fight each other, all you do is dull one another. When we gather together, let us sharpen one another. Let us make contact with each other in a way that makes us a sharp edge. But if we fight with one another, all that happens is we become a group of dull people. The second thing that we could do, a little sniffle. The second thing we could do is for us to strengthen one another. Have you ever gone into a place where the boats are tied to the pier? And if it's a place where they still use rope instead of chain or cable, close your eyes and listen to that rope. You will hear that rope creak as the tide pushes and pulls on that vessel and creates tension in that rope. That sound comes from the rubbing of actually several ropes that they weave together, they twine it together. And as one tightens up, the other one loosens up a little bit, and they rub on each other, and you hear that creaking sound. We have machines today that can weave one ginormous rope, but it wouldn't be very strong. It is the effect of several smaller ropes that work together in that way that makes it so strong. The second thing that we should do with one another, we find in Ecclesiastes chapter 4. Let's turn to Ecclesiastes chapter 4. And Ecclesiastes chapter 4, verse 9 to 12. Two are better than one. They have a good return for their labor. For if either of them fall, the other one will lift his companion up. But woe to the one who is by himself and he falls, and there is no one there to lift him up. Furthermore, if two lie down together, they keep each other warm. But how can one be warm all by himself? If one can be and if one can overpower him who is alone, two can resist. But a cord of three, that is very difficult to tear apart. We are to strengthen one another, become a cord, twined together. Can we do that as a community here? Sharpen one another, strengthen one another. Where you're weak, he's strong. Where you tighten up, he loosens up a little bit. The third thing we can do for one another is we can spur one another. We find this in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 24. And let us consider how to spur one another towards love and good works, not forsaking to get together, to assemble together, as it is the habit of some, but always encouraging one another, and all the more as we see the day draw near. We are to spur one another. I don't have a picture of a real cowboy boot with a spur on it, so I found a drawing. But it dawned on me that when I went to Thailand, the elephant riders, they spur the elephant in a different way. They sit right over the head of the elephant and they hold this stick that is about 18 inches long, and the end of the stick is a hook. And every so often, when they need to guide that elephant to do certain things, they stick that hook onto the cranium of that elephant. The first time I saw that, I go, ow, that must hurt. So I talked to them and they said, if we spurred an elephant like you spur a horse, we will kill that elephant. Because on its side, that's a very sensitive, tender area. But right up here on that elephant is inches of bone. We can't break through that. But it does give a little sting. So what are we to do with one another sometimes? We're to spur one another towards good works. Now, all of us have a spur right here. So if the person next to you is just nodding on, we can spur one another towards good works. But remember, spur them where it doesn't cause permanent hurt. Sometimes in the name of justice or morality or righteousness, we spur one another and we cause permanent hurt. Spur them where it doesn't do that. Today, we're going to have communion. And one of the passages that we go to whenever we talk about communion is in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. That's today's main passage. And it's a little bit longer, but I'd like to read it to you because it talks actually not just about communion, but about how to be together. Now, if you go to 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and you read verse 1 and 2, it says, "Be imitators of me, just as I also am of Christ. Now, I praise you because you remember me in everything and you hold firmly to the traditions that I've delivered to you." You hold firmly to the things that I've taught you. Now jump down to verse 17. So he starts off in this chapter, he says, "I give you praise because you have held on to what I've taught you." And then in verse 17, he says, "But in this instruction, I do not praise you." In this instruction, I wag my index finger at you. And I say, not good. What is it that Paul is not going to praise the church in Corinth for? He started off saying, "Good job, well done." And then he turns 180 degrees and he says, "But in this, not good." Let's read on. "Because when you come together, you do not come together for good, but for worse. For in the first place, when you come together as a church, I hear that there are divisions among you. And in part, I believe it. For there must be also factions among you, in order that those who are approved may become more evident. Therefore, when you meet together, it's not to eat the Lord's Supper, for in your eating, each one of you take his own supper first, and one is hungry while the other one is drunk. What? Do you not have your own homes to eat and drink? Or do you shame those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Shall I praise you for this? I will not praise you for this. See, this is what's happening back then. Communion was done not like the way we do it. They do it in homes. So they will say, today it's in this person's home. And so that's where people gather for communion. And they break bread together. And what happens is that person says, okay, today's my turn to host communion. And he calls his best buddies, the ones that are approved by him. And he says, come on over at 3. And then he tells everyone else, communion's at 5, people. Come on over at 5. And those who come over at 3, they get all the good stuff. They eat to the heart's content, they drink to the heart's content, and when the people show up at 5, there's not much left. And they shame them. And Paul is saying, why is there partiality? Why do you have these little cliques? Why do you treat each other this way? Why is there some approved and others not? In this kind of practice, I am not pleased with you. In this, you need to change. Now it goes on, verse 23, into the Lord's Supper. For I received from the Lord that which I delivered to you. The Lord Jesus, in the night when he was betrayed, he took bread, and he gave thanks, and he broke it, and he said, this is my body, which is for you. Every time you break bread, remember me. In the same way, he took the cup after supper, saying, this is the cup which is the new covenant in my blood. Do this, as often as you drink it, remember me. For as often as you eat the bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. Therefore, whoever eats the bread and drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner shall be guilty of the body and of the blood of the Lord. Let each man examine himself before he eats the bread and the cup. For he who eats the bread and the cup eats and drinks judgment on himself, if he does not judge himself rightly. For this reason, many of you are sick, many of you sleep. But if we judge ourselves rightly, we will not be judged. But when we are judged, we're under discipline by the Lord in order that we might not be condemned along with the world. So then, my brethren, when you come together to eat, wait for one another. Consider one another. If anyone is hungry, let him eat at home, so that you may come together, not for judgment. And in remaining matters, I shall arrange with you when I come. There are 3 things that I do whenever I take communion. The one that we're reminded of by many, many preachers who officiate communion is, do this in remembrance of me. When you take the bread and the cup, remember the sacrifice that Christ has given for you. We read in Philippians chapter 2 that he considered our interests as more important than his own interests as God, not taking upon himself his divine privileges, taking on the form of man. For who? For us. So in the same way, he says, remember the sacrifice that I made for you. But the second thing I also do before I take communion is I examine myself. Today, when we take communion, I'd like to ask you to do these 3 things. First, examine yourself. Second, consider your brothers and sisters. Start with those who are sitting around you. Consider them. Third, remember what the Lord has done for you. Remember that. What I've done today in your bulletin, when I went to seminary, we were asked to do this exercise. We were asked to look into every time the word, which translated into English is a phrase, it's the two-word phrase, one another, comes up. And so I have printed for you what Scripture tells us. This is how you are to be with one another. This is what it's supposed to be like. Take that home. As you consider one another, your brothers and sisters, this is how it should be. Because if it's not that way, imagine Apostle Paul speaking to you. In this, I do not have praise for you. But wouldn't it be great if he says, but in this you have kept my teaching, that you should consider one another, that you should examine yourself often, and that you should remember the sacrifice of Christ. Thank you.